Welcome to Lecture 9, everybody. Here we are transitioning from the medieval period to the Renaissance. And I'm wondering if many of you are excited about this change. I know I always am. I want many of you to know who might not that Renaissance is French for rebirth. And the question might be, what are we rebirthing? The rebirth refers to the renewed interest in antiquity, in Greek and Roman art, sculpture, writing, etc. So there is a renewed interest in this and a desire to recreate some of those things in the current age of the Renaissance. So just to compare these two periods, I have a couple graphics up here on this first page for you. The first, which is right behind the Dark Ages to Rebirth of Humanity writing, is a transverse section of a typical Gothic cathedral. And if you look at that, you can see there's a lot of geometrical shapes, the flying buttresses, things that are spire-like in the way that they're constructed, and of course those transepts that everybody always remarks upon when looking in a medieval cathedral. If you compare that to the portrait on your left, you can see that there are some pretty significant changes in the style going on here. The portrait on the left is much more round and soft in the way that it's been painted. Also, this is a very typical Renaissance portrait in that it's of an upper middle class or noble family. There's a lot of artistic symbolism actually going on in this painting. For example, the wife is obviously pregnant. That's a symbol of fertility for the family. There's also a view in the background of the marriage bed, meaning that they have a solid marriage and that they can expect to produce more children. They're both in extremely fine dress. She's wearing something that's been dyed green, and he's wearing an ermine cloak, which means that this is a family of wealth and position. There is a mirror in the background, which is meant to reflect their wealth and position and that it can increase in the future. There is also the little dog down at the bottom by the lady's feet, and he's a symbol of fidelity. So this is all very much in the style of the Renaissance. Having these images was very symbolic as well as very much part of the culture's way of showing that they had wealth and position. So looking at these two, you can see the differences in the style and in the symbolism. We have a lot of symbolism in the medieval cathedral as well, but this is perhaps a little bit more direct and a bit more humanistic in its approach. And if you don't know what humanism is, we'll discuss that very soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's deal with this transition that I'm talking about. Our same question that I gave you in the medieval period is also applicable here. When do we stop time in one period and then assign it to the next? Well, for music specifically, I would say that the beginning of the Renaissance starts somewhere between 1420 and 1425. And if you ask people in the arts and sciences, they will probably give you different dates, very likely earlier dates. The term Renaissance does not mean the same thing for music that it does for example, art, literature, and science. Since people are trying to recreate what they saw in the Greek and Roman eras, visual and literary artists can actually look at Greek and Roman writings and sculpture and physically recreate what they see. Unfortunately, of course, musicians cannot do this. We can only read what the ancient philosophers wrote about music, for example, the music of the spheres, and the mathematical relationships between intervals. However, we cannot go back in a time machine and hear what the music was like of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. And especially in the Renaissance period, they were unable to do some of the research that we recently have. We can, however, argue that there is a certain change in musical style in this time. And one of the first people to notice this musical change was a theorist named Johannes Tanctoris, and we know he was alive from 1435 to 1511. Tanctoris is probably our first important Renaissance theorist from what are called the Flemish countries. That's Holland, Belgium, and northern France. So they were called Flanders during this time. And before this time, the last person to codify a new change in music was in fact Philippe de Vitry in his Ars Novus treatise. So Tanctoris, in this particular writing that he wrote, which is called Definoritum Musices, written in 1475, is making much of the praise of his contemporaries, which he calls the best composers of this generation. The first four people that he lists are John Dunstable, whose dates are 1390 to 1453, Guillaume Dufay, 1397 to 1474, Gilles Banchouet, 1400 to 1460, and Johannes Ockeghem, 1420 to 1497. So in order of oldest to youngest. What's really interesting about Johannes Tanctoris' writing is that he in fact says that music during this time, which is more than 40 years old, is pretty much not thought to have any significance or value. So, since he's writing in 1475, we can assume he's talking about anything written after 1425, but nothing before this, and this is how we get our date for the Renaissance. Tinctoris also speaks in this treatise about the benefits of paying musicians well for their craft. Thank you, Tinctoris. And the first composer on his list is John Dunstable, who is then followed by Dufay and Binchouet. So observers of this period notice a marked difference in their music and what came before. Tinctoris also is very familiar with the term sweetness. This is a term that was used quite often when describing the stylistic switch from the medieval to the Renaissance period. So when describing the music of these gentlemen, he often says that their music has a type of sweetness, and that one should pay attention to that. The graphic I have on this slide is simply a page taken from another one of Tinctoris's treatises on music. This one is from the year 1498 and is called Terminorum Musicae Divinorium. So this is a different treatise than the one that I referenced earlier in this slide. You can see it's in Latin, and this was still the language of the learned and the educated. So Tinctoris was writing something else about defining music, the different definitions that are used in music, and how one should properly write music. So it's very helpful for our study, and we'll learn more on the next slide. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, a bit of background about how things are changing socially and economically in the Renaissance. If you remember, we just spoke in the last lecture about the Babylon captivity, also known as the Papal Schism, during the time in history when we have as many as 3 different popes for political reasons. This obviously produced a very big fracture in the Catholic Church. And finally, when Pope Gregory XI returns to Rome, he decides to establish both himself and the Catholic Church as important and as unified. And he does this by requiring that composers set the ordinary of the Mass in polyphony. Apparently, Guillaume de Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame really did set a trend in this way. In reference to Trecento music, we discussed that we begin to have certain courts developing in different cities, such as the Este in Ferrara and the Visconti in Milan. And this becomes a very wealthy century. And the courts in the north and the south are usually competing with one another in friendly ways to showcase the arts and the sciences, and this also showcases their power. So unlike today where you can buy a Maserati and appear very cool and show your wealth that way, the courts in this time period would sponsor art, music, and literature. And without these things, a ruler was really considered to be uneducated and incomplete. Having the ability to buy great works of art and show great works of art also showcased their power and ability to hire a mercenary army if necessary. In fact, there's a story of an English lord in the medieval period, transitioning into the Renaissance, who was having an argument with a neighboring lord about whose land was whose. So he invited the neighboring lord to dinner, and he showed him all of the many magnificent rooms in his castle, and showed him all of his art and beautiful tapestries, and then decided just for kicks to show him the armory room, where he showed all of the swords and all of the many axes he had in case of war. And the neighboring lord apparently gave way on whose land was whose. Learning, education, and being able to speak about classical works of antiquity, also writing poems and understanding music, are considered essential to a good ruler at this time, and this is mostly due to a change in humanism. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, humanism means the study of humanity and the reemergence of interest in ancient Greek and Roman cultures. The church is taking a backseat now to man, because the church has proven to be such a fractured entity in the medieval period. So one can now study the liberal arts and the human experience, and education therefore becomes a very hot topic. Various courts establish schools to learn about science and the Greek writers, as well as Greek and Roman art. And here's another thing we have to thank the Renaissance for. Scholarships are now being given to young people with limited financial means who are extremely intellectually gifted. Part of the reason that a ruler might want to do that is because as a ruler you need people to run the business of state for you, and so it is often helpful to train their education yourself. The landscape of music between 1400 and 1500 changes dramatically. Part of this shift had to do with the more frequent use of polyphony. We remember that Michaud was largely responsible for applying polyphony to secular music, and before 1500, as we know, very few people were trained in the use of polyphony. But by the year 1500, we have larger numbers of musicians performing and writing using polyphony. One of the great inventions of the Renaissance period is the advent of music printing in 1501 with Petrucci's Oddhekaton. This is a collection of 8 books that he printed, which were of music only. And this graphic I have up here actually shows you exactly what Petrucci's Oddhekaton looked like. Very beautiful and very well done printing. It was triple impression printing, meaning that it went through the press 3 times, and so therefore it's very, very beautiful and very, very well done. Single impression printing is faster, but usually doesn't look quite this good. So composers can now have their works widely published and distributed and become very well known in their fields, thank you to Mr. Petrucci in Venice. The availability of a composer's job market now rested on a composer's fame, so how well known they were, the grace of their patron. Whoever their patron was could allow them to publish their music, or they could also demand that the music only belonged to them and they could not publish their music. And the publication and distribution of their music, which, as I say, depended upon the grace of their patron. So these 3 things, composers' fame, the grace of their patron, and the publication and distribution of their music, were now what the availability of the job market rested upon for composers. Before we begin talking about the English school, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to make a small note, about the motet, because the motet is a genre which, as I said earlier, changes throughout its lifetime and its inception. So let's just review really quickly. We have now looked at the motet in the 13th century and in the 14th century. So I encourage you to take a look at this chart and see the differences between those two. That is in the medieval period, so keep that in your head. And then the 15th century motet is now going to be in the Renaissance period. So if you look at the description, you can see it's quite different. 15th century motet tends to be a very sacred genre, while 14th and 13th century motets can be sacred or secular and have some pretty different features. So just read over this chart and make sure that you remember the differences in the motet as it goes through the different centuries. Now on to the English school. When I use the term school, ladies and gentlemen, I want to be sure you understand that I'm not referring to a physical building, but a national style of composition that the English developed. Our source for this national school of composition is the Old Hall manuscript of 1440, and the graphic I have here is actually of that very same manuscript. These are some parts that were written by Dunstable. What's rather not new about the way this collection is organized is that it's much like liturgical polyphony, arranged by mass movement and text. So you have an entire section of Kyries, an entire section of Glorias, a bunch of Credos, a bunch of Sanctus and Agnus Dei, as well as settings of sacred music, such as sequences and texts. So this is different than the way that Machot's Messe de Notre Dame was organized. This is an important collection because now for the first time we have a manuscript with sizable portions of the Mass within in the 15th century. And as we look at the music of the English school, we can really see that a new and different style is emerging and being applied to motets and movements of the Mass. So I'm now going to list a few characteristics of the English school sound and the English school composition. What you will notice are extensive use of thirds and sixths as both harmonic and melodic intervals, and that results in the sweetness that Tenctoris was referring to in his treatise, which is associated with the English school. Thirds and sixths, why in the world would they start using those when the French disliked them so much? Well, remember in England we are a separate entity on an island, and they have a different tuning system in which thirds and sixths actually sound pretty good. Octaves and fifths are still, however, used for ending cadences, but you will definitely see more use of the third and the sixth. There's also control by the composer of dissonance and careful treatment of where dissonance occurs. You have great amounts of harmonic predictability, clearly defined cadences, a melodic sense of shape, use of one text in all voices, who generally sing that text at the same time. The accents of the music follow the accents of the text, and you generally have a very full sound, even in only 3-voiced pieces. The texture is homophonic, you have chordal writing, and something that we call cantilena style. This means the music was composed with the focus on the top voice down rather than the tenor up, which is what we've really heard until this point, especially in French music. So the melody is the key feature of this style. The English also focused on clarity and intelligibility of text, and a limited use of isorhythm until 1440, and then isorhythm is hardly used at all. This gentleman with the rather prodigious nose is Mr. John Dunstable. And he is the star of this musical generation and more or less of the English school of composition. Dunstable traveled extensively to the continent, especially to the region of Bretagne or Brittany, and at this point England and France still have rather loose boundaries as to where one ends and the other begins, thus the Hundred Years' War. Dunstable was there quite often in Brittany, so his manuscripts were very often copied on the continent, which is why we have so much of his music. Dunstable was not only a mathematician and a musician, but he was also a politician, so he was an extremely multi-talented man. His music tends to be more complex and sophisticated than that of some of his contemporaries. He makes a real effort to prepare cadences and to give us melodic ideas and cadential formulas which are then later used in the Renaissance, as opposed to the Landini cadence, da-dum, ba-dum. Dunstable would write a cadence that was something more like this, bum, ba-da-dum, bum. So something that's a bit more modern sounding to our ears, unlike the Landini cadence that I told you about. Lionel Power is another composer of the English school, but was much less well known than Dunstable. He was more or less a talented nobody. The reason that people do know who he is because he is the person who compiled the Old Hall manuscript, so some of his pieces are in there as well. And his music follows much more closely the ideals of the English school. The top two voices in his music tend to move more quickly and cross more frequently than the lowest two voices, if it's a four-voice piece. The Landini cadence and double leading tone cadence is also quite common in Power's music, as well as in the Ars Nova. So Power and Dunstable as a whole interested in clarity and intelligibility of text. However, cadences and phrase endings in Power's music tend to be more abrupt than in Dunstable's. So Dunstable is the more sophisticated of the two in terms of how he composes. And let's look at an example of one of his pieces. If you could turn in your nom-anthologies to page 165. And I will of course expect you to listen to this as well, CD 2, track 42, or CD 1, track 37. And just looking at this, first of all, let's take a look at the text. You might recognize this from the Song of Songs. How beautiful you are, and how graceful, dearest one, my delight. Your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like clusters of grapes. Your head is like Carmel, ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. What's interesting here is that this is the man speaking, and then later on, when it says, "Come, my beloved, let us go out into the fields, and let us see if the grape blossoms have borne fruit, and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my breasts." So this is obviously the woman speaking. So we have two different people in this dialogue, adapted from the Song of Solomon. So looking at this first line, you can see that this is fraught with thirds and sixths, not only in the harmonies, but in the melody. Looking at this first line, Quam pulchras. That's basically outlining a major triad. And we have some very nice small polyphonic decoration on the word deliciis, which is delicious. Statura tua, that is in homophony, just saying how stately this lovely lady is. And there's a lot of depiction of these words again. Est palme, like a palm tree. There's some polyphony there, and that is again to decorate the word palm tree and perhaps describe that word. You also have that again in measure 27 and 28, a burnea. So this is quite effective, I think. Your neck is like an ivory tower, to really describe what's going on. Then we have a sudden stop in the music in measure 31 on the word veni. And I believe that Dunstable does this because we are changing speakers here. This is when the woman is speaking and she's saying, "Come with me, my love." This is a very dramatic moment. And then we go back into this lovely polyphony again on the word agrum, which are the fields. Very appropriate that that should be decorated. And then there's mostly homophony the rest of the way through until of course we get to the word alleluia, which is such an emblem of praise in the Christian church. So once again we have some lovely decoration and polyphony there. You can see that he was influenced by what was going on in France, by his use of polyphony. But do look at these cadences. All of the dissonance that occurs is right before the cadences. And he does, in fact, use a Landini cadence at the very end of this, Luia, in the upper voice. So he's not quite departed from all of that, but it's definitely a step forward, and you'll find, I believe, that this sounds much more modern than anything else we've listened to. So I encourage you to do that now.